I've been doing Agile for the better part of 2 decades. I've seen it used with great success. There were teams that maintained a well-designed app that was easy to change and they always got their work done. But then there were also teams that were always behind, and not only that, it was obvious when you looked at the code base. If you aren't a fan of Agile, I don't blame you, because I've also been burned by bad practices and mismanagement. So I was really surprised when I started reading this book to do research for a different video. It's written by one of the original co-authors of Agile. I was surprised because what I see in practice is different than what's described in the book. We can group the differences into two main categories: the core principles and the methodology. If you read the original principles, you'll probably notice some patterns. The main recurring theme is quality and workmanship. But it's not just a theme, it's the main priority. Maintaining high quality and good design is what allows teams to maintain a constant pace. It's the prerequisite to speed and flexibility. But instead, what I see with modern teams is speed is the priority at the expense of quality. This is why change gets harder over time and teams get slower. Agile has fallen victim to a really long game of telephone. And just like the game of telephone, what it's turned into has completely lost its original meaning. The next main difference is in the process. There are several frameworks for implementing the Agile principles. The most common is Scrum, but what the book describes is extreme programming. Whether it's a web or Agile framework, teams tend to miss the point. The purpose of a framework is to get you up and running and then get out of your way so that you can focus on what's important, which is building your app. So many teams define themselves by the framework they use, when really the framework should be transparent. Unlike Scrum, extreme programming is a system that was designed by some of the best systems designers. And like a good abstraction, all the pieces have a clear purpose and fit together nicely. There is no fat or cruft. Here are some things that I won't cover, but let's briefly review some of the process outlined in the book. The main components are customers, developers, releases, iterations, stories, and tasks. Customers can be your actual customers or product owners. Basically, a customer is anyone who's not a developer. Then you have stories. Customers create stories with the help of developers. These are brief, high-level descriptions of a feature or functionality from a user's perspective. Developers then take those stories and break them down into tasks. These are lower-level steps required to complete the story. Tasks and stories are very different things. Stories don't contain any technical info. That's reserved for tasks. Also, customers are shielded from tasks. They should only be aware of and think in terms of stories. Finally, we have releases and iterations. These are how you break down and plan your project over time. Your project is broken down into releases, and releases contain one or more iteration. Next, we have planning, which comes in 3 flavors: release, iteration, and task planning. Release and iteration planning are essentially the same thing but on different timescales. The customer selects stories to be completed within the release or iteration. During task planning, those developers then take those stories and make a list of all of their tasks. Then, the developer starts to sign up for tasks. All of this happens before the iteration starts. After starting the iteration, at the halfway point, the team then assesses their progress by totaling the number of completed stories, not tasks. If half of the expected story points aren't done, then the team makes adjustments as necessary to ensure that everything is finished before the end of the iteration. This is when the book points out the nightmare scenario. The nightmare scenario is when you finish the iteration and 90% of your tasks are done, but you haven't finished any stories. Remember, the goal of an iteration is to complete stories, not tasks. And then finally, after the iteration, the customer is presented with a demo, and the team receives feedback in the form of new user stories. That was a brief outline of the process described by the book. Hopefully a lot of this sounds familiar, but for me, there are some key differences. First, developers don't sign up for anything before the iteration starts. Also, tasks and anything related to tasks don't exist. And stories are being used as tasks, and there's some confusion about what a story is and its role. I was on a team where we would go through the iteration before it started, and at the end of the meeting we were asked if we thought we could finish all the work. But nothing was ever assigned up front. Whenever one task was done, we would just pick up the next one, practically at random. So whenever we were asked, we would always say we thought we could finish all the work. And we could have won a perfect attendance award because we could never finish a sprint. So why do you think we always said we thought we could finish the work, but we could never actually do it? I think it's because there are too many variables, and it makes it impossible to give an accurate answer. I never know what I'm working on next. I don't even know how many things I'm going to work on this sprint. I don't know what my teammates are working on, and if that work plays into their strengths. For example, if a coworker picks up a task that will take them 1 day, but if I picked up the same task and it would only take me half a day, doesn't that increase the team's chances of finishing the work? By assigning the work beforehand, I can make informed decisions about how to spend my time, because I always know what work I have left and how much time I have left to do it. Not only that, but the developers are signing up for work themselves, so they're more likely to pick up things that they're confident in. For the remaining differences, let's look at a simulation over time. We have two scenarios. The top one resembles what I see in practice. The bottom one is what the book describes. They each have the same number of stories, broken down into the same number of tasks. Also, for each iteration, they have 8 task slots. Of course, I'd like to note that this isn't realistic. Not all tasks are equal. This is just done to keep the simulation simple. Now, we have iteration planning for the first iteration. The top scenario treats tasks like stories. It actually calls them stories, even though they're technically steps and not user stories. These are thought of as independent pieces, not parts of a whole. And in the book scenario on the bottom, customers add whole stories to the iteration. As a result, all of the tasks move with it. We can already start to notice some of the implications of this. But what is the state of the world after the first iteration is done? Both scenarios completed the same volume of work in terms of tasks. The top scenario only completed one whole story, and there are 6 other stories that are in an incomplete state. Because its tasks are treated as stories, and they could be delivered without technically breaking things, they're delivered, even though they don't result in real functionality being added for the customer. In other words, we have technical debt, and we're guaranteeing that we always have technical debt. In the bottom scenario, we delivered 3 whole stories. That's already 2 more than the top scenario. Also, we're left with 0 work in progress. There's 0 work that's in a partial state. This means that our app is complete and stable. Next, we have planning for the second iteration. This is a lot like the first iteration. The top scenario is all over the place. The team is fragmented, and it's basically a scramble to get as much work done as possible. The bottom scenario has fewer stories, but again, the same volume of work is getting done. Because there are fewer stories, different developers can pick up tasks from the same story. This encourages collaboration and teamwork. Developers aren't treated like interchangeable cogs, which, contrary to popular belief, is not the point of Agile. It also keeps the team focused because there are fewer goals. They're able to move as a single unit. By the end of the iteration, the bottom scenario has more stories delivered. The app is in a better state. Nothing is in progress, which also has an effect on developer morale and preventing burnout. In the top scenario, it never feels like anything is ever done. It never feels like the app is stable. Stories that should only take 2 weeks to complete are taking 2 months because they're broken apart and distributed across multiple iterations. And this is a common issue I see beyond just planning and project management. It's the issue of flipping something on the wrong axis. The top scenario is trying to cast a wide net because it creates an illusion that you're covering more ground. It feels like you have more work started, so it feels like you're making more progress. But in reality, you're stretching your team thin, and it doesn't just affect your people. It also has long-term effects on the quality and stability of your app. So now, when iteration 3 is done, what do you see? The top scenario has a bunch of work in progress. Some stories have been worked on for 3 iterations now, and there are still 7 stories left. Again, the bottom scenario has delivered real value every time. The team stayed focused the whole time, they maintained a better quality app by not delivering incomplete features, and they've gotten further along. There's more work done. Here we are after only 3 iterations, and look at how different the 2 scenarios are. Imagine how different they're going to look after 1 or 2 years. Remember the nightmare scenario. Look at how many stories have tasks completed, but those stories aren't delivered. Now imagine we didn't complete all of the tasks, and they were even further delayed. Something that would have been expected to take 2 months will now take even longer. And what happens when we pivot between iterations, and one of those partial stories falls out of priority? Then our app is left with technical debt. But in the bottom scenario, we aren't leaving any loose ends. If you made it this far, like, subscribe, and all that fun stuff, and leave a comment. I'd love to hear what other teams are doing and if it works for you.